by the sea,
by the beautiful sea.
You
Morning.
and me.
I'm your host, Harry Orgovan, and welcome to the first in a series of Our Lives, Our Future, where we're meeting with leaders in our community. This is presented to you by the South Bay Historical Society and the Chula Vista Heritage Museum. Today we're meeting with Andrew Yuen. He's the project leader from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Is it okay if I call you Andy?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you.
So I would like to maybe start off with where you were born and raised and where you were educated, both early on and in college.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Harry. So it's great to see you again. I was born in Hawaii when Hawaii was a territory before it was a state, and it was very fortunate that I lived in Hilo. The area that I was raised was next to a stream, and that Honolulu stream really shaped much of my life. So when I went to college, I went to the University of California at Berkeley, and then I went to graduate school at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And when you look at connecting all of the dots, my research project at the University of Hawaii was studying a native goby that lives in the streams in Hawaii called the o'opu. And it was actually the first fish that I ever caught as a child.
Oh.
And then working on this research project that was looking at the changes in habitat for this native o'opu.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, there was a significant interest in the freshwater biology of Hawaii and of the stream fishes and the things that live in the streams. And so I was able to convert into working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a biologist back in 1984. So from my childhood in playing in the streams and fishing and catching really my first native o'opu to studying it in graduate school to my career with the Fish and Wildlife Service, all of those dots somehow connected in a way that I would have never imagined.
So what year was that?
I started in 1984,
84.
and so I've been with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in various capacities for since then, since 1984.
How long have you been the project manager?
I've been the project leader here at the San Diego National Wildlife Refuge Complex since 2005. I've been involved in the wildlife refuges here in South San Diego County, and during that period of time, as you know, we managed the Tijuana Slough, the San Diego Bay, the San Diego Refuge, which is the inland refuge, as well as the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge in Orange County. Well, to me, it's been this amazing opportunity to work for an agency that aligns with my personal beliefs as well. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has, as part of it, the National Wildlife Refuge System, which I work for. So we have 560 plus national wildlife refuges across the country in every state, 38 wetland management districts, 95 million acres of land, 170 million acres of water and submerged areas that are all part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. So really an amazing diversity of habitats and lands that have been conserved. And then personally here in San Diego, the opportunity for the wildlife refuges to improve the quality of life for the residents so for example, Chula Vista. We're at the front doorstep of Chula Vista Sweetwater Marsh, and we're the Living Coast Discovery Center. And then we happen to be the back 40, of Chula Vista with the San Diego National Wildlife Refuge. So, the refuge here brackets in, the communities, and then it provides an opportunity of open space for the residents to go out for a hike or explore nature. Similarly in Imperial Beach, where at one end is the Tijuana Slough National Wildlife Refuge and the other end is the San Diego Bay National Wildlife Refuge. Again, opportunities for the refuges to be part of the communities, not just as open space, but as an amenity, so people can appreciate nature, go out for a hike or for a walk.
Can you describe the different refuges to me and their applications of use?
Sure. Well, we have coastal wildlife refuges. So from Seal Beach, San Diego Bay, and Tijuana Slough, we manage a significant area of coastal salt marsh and tidal estuaries. And if you look at Southern California as a whole, so much of these tidal marshes and salt marshes and estuaries have been converted into urban uses. So we have these little pockets of salt marsh and estuaries that we protect. And so they serve as habitat for many species of fish and birds. So at the Seal Beach and San Diego Bay and Tijuana Slough, we have habitats for the endangered light-footed ridge-waist rail, the endangered California least tern, the threatened western snowy plover, the endangered salt marsh birdspeak, which is a plant. So many of the really rare species that were much more common in Southern California are finding their last little pieces of habitat in these wildlife refuges. And then many of our wildlife refuges also provide opportunities for the public. So we have trails on our refuges, so people can go bird watching, or if they just want to go out for a walk. And living in the new normal, getting outside and getting an opportunity to be in the sunshine and fresh air, I think is recharging for many people. And then the San Diego National Wildlife Refuge, which is our inland refuge, really was a part of the regional effort to conserve habitats and direct growth to less sensitive areas. So when you look out across San Diego, the Mother Miguel, the San Miguel Mountains, all that open space that forms the backdrop to metropolitan San Diego, much of that is part of the San Diego National Wildlife Refuge. So coastal sage scrub, chaparral habitats, that then these areas for wildlife, as well as opportunities for the public to go for a hike. And we do have trails. And in fact, we just finished a parking lot so that we are able to better provide access to the public.
Speak to me about out on these mesas inland, when the rains come, what happens out there?
So many of these mesas are flat as you're leading to, and they collect water. And in many of these mesas are vernal pools. And these vernal pools support unique species that have adapted to that particular type of ecosystem where they stay flooded for short periods of time, and life blooms in a very quick burst. They complete their life cycle, whether they bloom as flowers or as fairy shrimp, and as that water evaporates and the ponds dry out, they go into a long dormant phase, waiting for the next round of rains. And so it really is an amazing adaptation that these vernal pool species have made, to live in a highly variable environment, full of water during parts of the year and bone dry in others, and with an extended drought, able to stay dormant for long periods of time.
So what would you consider some of your accomplishments since you've worked for Fish and Wildlife?
Well, I've been fortunate to work on projects where I've had really amazing partners, whether it's other government agencies, non-governmental organizations, individuals, all committed to making a difference in the world, to conserving wildlife, protecting wild places. And so when I look back, I look at the creation of the San Diego National Wildlife Refuge, second largest city in California, 10th largest city in the United States, and that the local governments and the agencies came together and said, we want to create space for wildlife and open space in the midst of a highly urbanized environment really is a significant accomplishment when you think of all of the challenges of urbanization and protecting habitat at the same time. And then I look at protecting salt marshes, the addition of the salt ponds to the National Wildlife Refuge system in South San Diego Bay, and then the restoration of those areas, the creation of new salt marshes out of tidal ponds, either at the south end of San Diego Bay or at the Tijuana estuary, seeing these areas come back to what they were 100 years ago, bringing nature back to areas that might have been thought of as lost, but actually could be converted and restored back as wildlife habitat. And then I think the other third thing is that we've been able to connect urban communities with wildlife and nature. So the SoCal Urban Wildlife Refuge Project, which is bringing together a number of our non-governmental organizations, partnerships with communities to bring youth and families and children out to the wildlife refuges, really has been a tremendous thing to see. I like to say that one of the benefits of where I work is that I get to see the school buses pull in, and all of these kids are jumping out of the school buses. They're all excited, they're all happy, they're giggly wild, and then they go out onto the refuge or they go onto the Discovery Center, and then in the afternoon I get to see them all load back onto the bus. They're all happy, they've had a wonderful experience, and you can see that they're going to be the next generation, and that they're walking home talking to their family about this connection that they made with nature, and that can only help us in the future.
Well, Andy, one of the things that are going on in our society right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and one of the things I use is Dr. Bonner's spray disinfectant, which helps me keep sanitary and clean. And I understand you use Dr. Bonner's soap to actually bathe with after surfing. Is that correct?
Yes. Take a hose and out and water over myself in my yard.
During these trying times we're going through right now, how has that affected your work at the United States Fish and Wildlife?
So we are sheltering in place as an effort to contain the spread of the virus. And in cases where we have some field work, we've gone through an approval process where they are taking a variety of safety measures to ensure that they're protected, as well as any of the colleagues that they might be working in the field are protected, and having a very limited amount of field activity. We still have our law enforcement officers and our firefighters on the job, and they've also taken various steps to ensure that they're limiting their exposure to the coronavirus as well. But for many of the things that we do, we've been, teleworking from home, staying in touch with all of the tools that have now become available to reach out to your colleagues, whether it's conferencing online or using your internet access. And
can you speak to me about the multi-species conservation program, what it is, and how you're working with the current government systems to bring that about?
The San Diego Multiple Species Conservation Program is now over 25 years old. It recently celebrated a significant milestone in its birthday. And it really was an attempt by local governments, by the County of San Diego, the City of San Diego, the City of Chula Vista, and other local governments to develop a blueprint for development and a plan for long-term habitat conservation. Because the trends were more conflict if we didn't find a way to cooperate and work together. So the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and these local agencies and the cities developed this conservation program, the multiple species conservation program, that in its simplest identified areas for conservation and areas for development. And that way, the conservation community would realize benefits, because instead of small little mitigation pieces shotgunned across the county, we could in a better conservation biology design have large consolidated preserves that protected larger blocks of habitat, and at the same time provide certainty to the local governments and to developers about where they would be permitted to develop. So it was a compromise action amongst all of the parties to bring certainty and ensure long-term conservation. And I think then it created open space that rather than have an area that looks like downtown Los Angeles, we have these areas with green spaces, with open space, with green belts that I think ended up making our communities more livable.
You mentioned it's 25 years old. So does that mean that this is something that works for us today, or does it need improvement along the way, would you say?
Well, I think with all programs, we're always looking at ways to improve. And as we have moved with the San Diego Multiple Species Conservation Program, I think one of our long-term challenges is funding the management of these areas. So we've set aside areas for conservation, but many of these areas need management, whether it's controlling invasive weeds or restoring habitats. All of the day-to-day details of managing any piece of land. So I think the next big step is ensuring that these areas are fully managed off into the future, so that they can provide all of the benefits that we hope that they can provide both to wildlife and to the public.
Talk to me about the San Diego Comprehensive Conservation Plan of 2006.
I'm going to call it the CCP.
Okay.
Really is about the most thumb-through document on my desk. It is something that I turn to almost on a daily basis. It's our vision for managing the San Diego Bay National Wildlife Refuge. So all of the really amazing things that we've done in San Diego Bay were identified as part of that plan. So I flipped through the plan, to see where we are and what opportunities exist. So the restoration of the D Street fill with San Diego Gas and Electric, or the restoration of the Western Salt Ponds with a myriad of partners, including the Port of San Diego and the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The planning to restore 125 acres of salt marsh with Poseidon Resources. All of those projects are identified in our CCP. So we've gone through a long-term planning effort, identified all of these opportunities, both to restore and conserve and provide multiple use trails on the refuge. All are guided by that plan. So it's been a great tool for us, because it spells out our long-term vision, and then it also helps the public understand what our priorities are, where we may be headed in the future.
So tell me about a restoration project you've done with the California Waterfowl Association.
Many years ago, out on Sweetwater Marsh on Gunpowder Point, there was an old access road that went out to Gunpowder Point, and that road prevented a full exchange of tidal water across the marsh. And so the California Waterfowl Association removed that old road, excavated it out of the marsh, and so now we have better tidal circulation in Sweetwater Marsh as a result of that road removal, and it was part of a recognition that improving tidal circulation would be good for the restoration of the salt marsh.
So speaking about the Sweetwater Marsh, That has a lot of history to it, doesn't it? Can you tell me some of the history of that particular marsh area before it ever became a federal refuge?
Sure. Well, you can imagine that this upland area, like many upland areas on the edge of San Diego Bay, were highly productive and valued by the native Kumia. That when you look at the middens that they were using the salt marshes and the bay as an important resource for their livelihood and part of their culture. So the very earliest parts of Sweetwater Marsh and the upland area we now call Gunpowder Point was by the native Kumia. And during World War I, probably the most notable aspect of what we call Gunpowder Point was that it was used to ferment kelp and create acetone and potash for the World War I effort. So they harvested kelp offshore, barged it into San Diego Bay. There was a pier that ran out into the bay. They brought the kelp and fermented it in these giant redwood tanks, and then through an industrial process, they converted the kelp into acetone and potash. They shipped it to Great Britain to make smokeless gunpowder, and it was a very important, valuable contribution to the Allied efforts to win World War I. So in Chula Vista, there's actually a place called Potash Junction. If you go out to Gunpowder Point, some of the old structures are still there. You can see the old railroad track in places. So while they never made gunpowder out on Gunpowder Point, it certainly had a better sounding and catchy name than Acetone Point. So I think the marketing department won on that one when they said, let's call it Gunpowder Point. And then it has, it had a second life as a cotton seed air project, and then tomato farming, and then the wildlife refuge. That entire area of Chula Vista, is rich in history, not just, of course, Gunpowder Point and the evolution of the Living Coast Discovery Center, but as you probably know better than anyone else, the other industrial activities, Roar and aviation in Chula Vista, all were centered in that bayfront area.
So down at the very south end of the bay, we have the salt works. That has quite a history in that particular area too. Can you describe that and how over time Fish and Wildlife has gotten involved with the salt ponds, the restoration, and a little bit more about that?
Sure. So at the very south end of San Diego Bay, in one of the few places in the United States where salt is still made by evaporating bay water, the South San Diego Bay Salt Works is actually on the wildlife refuge, and they operate under a special use permit, and they pull in bay water from San Diego Bay and move that water through all of their ponds. And as the water evaporates, the brine becomes more and more salty, and eventually it dries out, and different types of salts precipitate out, and so then they harvest the salt and use it for industrial purposes, water softeners, de-icing roads, not here of course, but they ship that salt throughout the United States, and so those big piles of salt that you see are the material that they've harvested really by evaporating water out of San Diego Bay. And the interplay between the salt ponds and the refuge is that the levees and the dikes of the salt ponds provide habitat for ground nesting seabirds and shorebirds. So right now, for example, in this summer migratory period, thousands and tens of thousands of terns are nesting on the dikes and levees of South San Diego Bay on the refuge. And it really is a spectacular display of the abundance of nature at the backdrop of 3.5 million people. So thousands of seabirds nesting on this area, critical for the productivity of these migratory birds. Is this little area at the very south end of San Diego Bay for these seabirds and shorebirds.
I've heard it's the only place in the world where 5 species of terns can be nesting and present at one time.
That's correct. We have an amazing number of tern species there, as well as a variety of other migratory birds that are out on the salt flats.
So that's been there since 1871 and was originally named La Punta Sol. So tell me about the Otay River Delta restoration.
Well, at the end of Main Street, next to Swiss Park, was an old agricultural field that was acquired by using funds from the California Coastal Conservancy, and then conveyed to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So again, this partnership with all of these entities, California Coastal Conservancy, the Southwest Wetlands Interpretive Association in Imperial Beach, all working together to protect this Otay River floodplain. And it was dominated then by non-native chrysanthemum, very little value for native wildlife. And through a grant from the California Department of Transportation, another nonprofit organization called River Partners was able to convert that chrysanthemum fields into a woodland forest. And these types of woodland forests along river courses are very important for a number of birds. And so when you walk there now, it's a forest along the Otay River. So it's another project where we've taken areas that have been degraded and brought them back to native wildlife habitat.
What's happening with the D Street fill? The restoration of it and also contamination in certain parts of it.
So if we could look back in time, you would see that the salt marshes along the south part of San Diego Bay have slowly been converted into industrial uses. And the D Street fill was an area that was former salt marsh that got filled in, and in the late 80s, when the Wildlife Refuge was being created, those lands were conveyed to the Wildlife Refuge. And for the most part, the D Street fill is now the D Street nesting site, because least terns and other migratory birds nest out on the sandy, flat area of D Street. Now, about 5 years ago, San Diego Gas and Electric restored about 11 acres of salt marsh habitat out on D Street. So they pulled back the old fill and uncovered the salt marsh that was underneath the fill, and created tidal channels, opened it up, and now that's a flourishing new salt marsh, 11 new acres in San Diego Bay. And then they took the material that had been excavated and elevated the fill and put the nice sandy material back on top, so that area now has long-term sea level rise resilience. So we can ensure that as sea levels change, that the nesting habitat will remain on D Street. So it was a project in partnership with San Diego Gas and Electric that had the dual benefit of restoring salt marsh habitat, as well as creating some sea level rise resilience for nesting seabirds.
So tell me about what you're involved with education-wise and outreach.
We had previously mentioned the SoCal Urban Wildlife Refuge Project, and really it's an opportunity where, stretching from Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge in Ventura County where the Refuge is working with the local school district. Literally, the California condor flies over the school district. And so working with Santa Barbara Zoo, they developed an educational program called Condor Kids. So they're introducing these school children to really one of the iconic wildlife species of California, the California condor, so that they understand really that they live in the footprint of this magnificent bird. And then we have an opportunities in the Los Angeles River Basin, where we're working with groups to bring them out to the Los Angeles River. And the focus, though, has been our efforts here in San Diego, where we have a number of groups that are focused on bringing youth, young adults, families out to connect with nature. So it's everything from the Living Coast Discovery Center, of course. You know, they bring all of the elementary school children from Chula Vista out to the Living Coast Discovery Center. And then they also have an opportunity to explore the Refuge. So they get both a classroom and an outdoor experience, as well as connecting with schools that neighbor the wildlife refuges. And then we do have opportunities where we've put in a new trail, for example, at the south end of San Diego Bay, the Bayside Birding and Walking Trail. It parallels a portion of the Bayshore Bikeway. And the idea there is if you want to enjoy a walk along the edge of the bay and not have, be worried about the bicyclists, you can walk, you can watch birds, you can have a nice stroll. And then we have interpretive signs. So all of those are efforts to ensure that people can understand and appreciate and value these areas of the wildlife refuges, that they can appreciate nature in their backyard, and then help us keep it going forever.
Can you talk to me about eelgrass? It's such an important plant that's growing from the bottom of the muds of the bay, and how it's being used by certain species. A lot of people don't know it, but we have the Eastern Pacific green sea turtles in our bay that utilize it. And I know the brant also utilize it. Can you talk a little bit about eelgrass and helping protect it and that type of thing?
As you described, we have eelgrass beds throughout the south end of San Diego Bay. And there are many species that are dependent upon that eelgrass, both as a food source and as habitat. They're very rich biologically. They produce a lot of nutrients, they provide a lot of habitat. And amazingly, San Diego Bay has a population of the green sea turtle, the East Pacific green sea turtle, and they forage in these eelgrass beds. So, another unique resource here in San Diego Bay, and in the south end of San Diego Bay, you have these green sea turtles, and during the migratory season, like you were mentioning, the brant loaf in San Diego Bay. And they eat the eelgrass, and you can hear them cooing. They have a very unique call out in the bay, and so they also are dependent upon the richness of the eelgrass beds in South San Diego Bay.
What are your challenges that you're facing in the future as we move forward?
Well, there are many challenges in managing these areas, and part of our view is that we're here forever. That we want these areas to provide habitat for wildlife and provide opportunities for the public forever. We are here in the long term. And I think that our biggest challenges are actually the small things that people can do to benefit wildlife and open space. There are small things that will really make a big difference. We talk about having people put their dogs on leashes when they walk along the beaches. And it's important because these birds are migrating from thousands of miles, and they're stopping here to nest, recharge, get their young fed and ready for the long migration back. So protecting these young birds and the nesting birds from unnecessary disturbance is part of the reason why we encourage people to keep their dogs on a leash. We'd want the birds to be wasting their energy running away from dogs and humans when they should really be building up their reserves for their long trip back. And then in protecting these great open spaces, a simple thing of staying on the trail. It is not that we are, we want people to appreciate and enjoy the outdoors, but staying on the trail really does make a difference in terms of reducing erosion and disturbing wildlife. We do want to have areas that are open to the public where they can enjoy wildlife, they can enjoy the scenery, but at the same time, we don't want these areas to be loved to death. So we do have areas that we've set aside for wildlife, that we really are trying to limit the amount of human disturbance. And then other small things are litter and trash. We all are aware of the impact of plastics on the environment. And really one of the new emerging, things we see are masks being disposed of on the ground. And really, we just ask people to practice some trail etiquette. Pick up your trash, bring your masks home, dispose of your trash and masks and water bottles in a responsible way. So I think our biggest challenge is getting people to do the small things, because all of those small things really add up and really will make a difference.
Absolutely. I'd definitely like to reiterate what you're saying, because I do many trash pickups, and people don't realize, even when you're disposing trash on the land somewhere, the wind and water through storm water can bring that down into the bay and into the oceans. And it's a huge problem. If we didn't have trash pickups by a lot of community members, our area wouldn't look very good. So I'd really like to impress upon the public to please pick up your trash. It's one of the biggest things you can do for yourselves, wildlife, and nature and the environment.
And I want to thank all of the volunteers that you've led over time to clean up the material and the trash that has washed up along the edges of the marshes. So, you and your volunteers and your colleagues have all really made a difference, because otherwise that material would just pile up if it wasn't for volunteers like you that went out and donated your time and effort to clean these areas up.
Well, we appreciate that. Thank you very much. That's very nice of you to say.
We're all in this together. I like to say there's no planet B. We're this is it. We're on a single earth, and we all are part of a community and to make of humans as well.
Andy, it's been a pleasure having you with us today and learning so much about our refuges and reserves. And I just wish you the best in your life, and just hope that as your career extends. By the way, how much longer are you going to be with fishing?
For a while longer.
Okay.
No immediate plans.
Okay, good. And well, thank you again, Andy, and I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Beside the sea, beside the seaside, by the beautiful sea.